Next, I want to talk about soil texture. And the thing to note is that there are different size categories of particles in the soil. So the rock material is broken up into smaller pieces. We classify these into 3 categories. Sands are the larger of the 3, and clays are the smallest of the 3. And then there's an intermediate category of silt. Sand would be more like beach sand. Silt would be about the texture of talcum powder. And clays are so small that they're invisible. They're just sort of a sticky material. They're the tiniest material that can be considered part of the soil. Soils don't typically have all of one or the other. Oftentimes they can be a mixture of silt, clay, and sand. There are different categories. So for example, a loam is a mixture of all 3, clay, silt, and sand. You can have silty clay, which is silt and clay, or sandy clay, and so on. And by looking, and you can have different percentages of clay, silt, and sand, and those percentages can be classified into these different categories. Soils also develop in layers, and we call those layers horizons. There's various, it goes from the O, which stands for organic, to R, which is the bedrock at the bottom, and the soil is really in between. One way I remember this is to do it like this. You go O for organic, and in between you have A, B, C. There's also an E horizon in there, but it's easier to remember if you just ignore that and just go A, B, C. And at the very bottom is the R layer, or the bedrock. So R is for rock at the bottom, O is for organic on top, and then there's an A, B, C in between, and there's also an E layer in between there too. The organic layer is part of the biosphere. It is made of organic material, like dead plants. And the R is part of the lithosphere. It's the rock material. And then those mix in between in the A, E, B, and C horizons. Sorry, had to make that smaller. Okay, O, and let's start at the top. The O is organic. It is plant material above the soil. We call this humus, and humus is just the kind of like dead leaves and grasses and things like that at the very top. And below that is the A horizon, what we often call the topsoil. It is the one part of the soil with the most amount of organic material, which kind of makes sense because it's placed right near the O horizon. Below that, and some, by the way, you don't always have all of these horizons. Only the most mature soils have an E horizon. And that's called the zone of elevation. And what that means is that material is kind of getting washed out from here, and then it's accumulating down in the B horizon, which is zone of elevation. I don't like terms that kind of sound like each other, but one has an E, one has an L, but that's what's going on here. Essentially, material is being washed down and collecting in the B horizon. So alluviation is where it gets washed out, and then it collects down into the zone of illuviation with an I below there. I should note, however, that many soils, especially the soils around where we live in the Central Valley, lack an E horizon, and it goes straight from A to a B. Now, underneath that is the C horizon, which is unaltered, or at least not that much altered parent material. Essentially, this is crushed up rock. This comes from the rock that makes up the parent material, but it's crushed into smaller pieces, and that is sort of the bottom of the soil layer. And then underneath, once you get below that, you're down to the bedrock, or the R layer. There's a term called the Solem, which is about the stuff that, essentially, it's all the stuff above the C horizon. And this is really where all of the action is happening. There's a lot of soil formation happening from the organic layer down to where minerals are collected in the B layer. And below that is essentially the bed on which the soil sits. So again, O, A, B, C, and R. This is showing that the grasses on top would be part of the organic part. This rich topsoil here, you can see it's really dark. This one shows up really well, would be the A horizon or topsoil. There's a little bit of a washed out area underneath. That would be the E. And then down below that, where it's a little bit darker, this would be where stuff is washed up from the E layer and collected in the B layer, and so on. And these don't, we talked about earlier about time being an important soil formation factor, and these layers don't develop all at once. That you start off with fresh parent material, and then you can get grasses. Grasses can go pretty much anywhere. They can live and die and live and die, and they can contribute organic material until you have a more developed topsoil. So you start out with just a C horizon, the parent material, and a little A horizon, a little bit of topsoil. Now, as minerals wash down from this topsoil, that develops a B horizon. The B horizon is where minerals and things get washed or leached down and collect above the C horizon. And then over a long period of time, the most mature soils start to get washed out underneath the A horizon, and that's what makes the E horizon.